Welcome to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, at this time hosted by a new podcast platform, which is the Politics in Motion platform. My first presentation will concentrate on the understanding of the mode of production as a totality from the standpoint of the emancipated laborer. At the end of the companion I wrote to Marx's Grundrisse, I suggested that one of the subtexts that seemed to be buried in Marx's meanderings in that rather magnificent book, that a subtext was to ask the question, what would an emancipated laborer think of the way in which capital works? Marx declares his determination to try to understand the whole workings of the capitalist system and, in fact, to construct a theory of a capitalist mode of production. And in that, he was moving step by step to look at the contradictions within the capitalist political economy in ways which were very revealing to the worker in terms of why it was that the kind of oppressions that they were experiencing were absolutely essential to the organization of that mode of production. The answer, of course, was simple, that workers are not there to produce goods, they're not there to produce commodities, they are there to produce profit. In Marx's language, they are there to produce surplus value. And this is the main thing they produce, and that surplus value, however, is incorporated in the production of things, so that the production of things and processes and all the rest of it is the means by which the profit is created. So this was the idea, and throughout it seemed to me there was a kind of question mark all of the time as to what would a worker think of this. And step by step, as they thought of it, they became more and more emancipated. And so the idea came to my mind that we should really start to think about what might be called the pedagogy of the emancipated laborer. Now, in this, of course, I'm riffing off of Gilberto Frere and his discussion of the pedagogy of the oppressed. Now, the point here is not to imagine that somehow or other the worker could become mentally emancipated entirely from the travails of how a capitalist system worked, and then after being emancipated this way, go about the task of reconstructing it. No, that's not what Marx had in mind, and it's not what I would have in mind. But what I would have in mind is to try to construct a theoretical framework in which people can better understand the kind of society in which we live and why the society in which we live has certain characteristics which seem irredeemable and unchangeable without actually overthrowing the mode of production itself and actually creating an alternative, a socialist mode of production or even perhaps a communist mode of production. Now, Marx, in proposing this and pursuing this, is actually asking the worker to stretch themselves somewhat in terms of their understandings. In Marx's day, the audience was largely that of the self-educated worker. And I think that this is something we might want to think about as we come to the idea of what would the pedagogy of an emancipated worker look like. That pedagogy would have to begin with the situation of the worker in relationship to capital and how capital absolutely structures the forms of remuneration and the forms of exploitation and oppression within which the worker has to exist. So what, in fact, we're looking at here is to ask the question, if production has to be organized in this way, then are there ways to actually see glimmers of possibility of alternatives at each point in the analysis? In other words, we'd look at what is actually happening and then ask the question, what kinds of things can be done to change how this world works? And in doing this, the creation of the theory of the Marxist mode of a Marxist theory of the mode of production is to try to actually set up a full understanding and a framework in which those questions can be posited and those questions can be partially answered. Now, there is a problem here, and it's this. Marx clearly sees that the processes of capital accumulation are not static. Technology is constantly changing, consumption patterns are constantly changing, consumerism is constantly changing, the political framework is constantly changing. In other words, Marx is going to be talking about a system that is in evolution. But it is in evolution at the same time as it constitutes what he called a totality. And this is where I would really like to start. Let us think about capital as a totality. Let us think about its creation, how it is created. Let us think about how it is actually developed over time and how it changes. But in so doing, what Marx argued was that we needed concepts which could capture the situation. And the trouble is that the concepts are tend to get fixed. And in a sense, the theorization that we construct is going to be dependent upon fixed constructs in order to calculate what is happening in a changing world. And at a certain point, we would like to follow Marx and say, wouldn't it be good if we could have concepts which are themselves evolving at the same time as capital is evolving? That, it turns out, is a bit too hard to do, so we're going to use a set of fixed categories initially in order to try to understand what the nature of capital is about and what might be done to change it. Now, one of the things that I suggested was that the real framework in which Marx cast all of this was as follows, that he decided to think of a totality, but a totality that is constituted by multiple circulation processes. And I use the analogy of the human body as an example, that the human body can be thought of as a totality. But at the same time, it is constituted by the circulation of matter and by a variety of circulatory processes. For example, blood circulates from the heart, oxygen circulates through the lungs, energy through the digestive system, the brain also intervenes in this. So there are many circulatory processes that actually constitute a human body. And it turns out that almost all scientific investigations at a certain point define a totality and then look at the circulatory processes. And these circulatory processes are actually movements through different, what Marx called moments. And so you've got these three terms: totality, circulation process, and moments. For instance, when we're looking at the circulation of capital, we see that at one moment, capital exists as money. At the next moment, it exists as inputs of labor and of material goods and so on, commodities, into production. It then has a moment of production. It is then sold, and there's a moment of realization of the value of a commodity in the market by a sale. So the general framework is then one in which there's a totality, circulatory processes, and different moments within each process. Now, these moments have a distinctive character. For example, one of the very important things that happens with capital is, of course, that capital is mobile. It can move around the world. But in what state must it be to move most easily around the world? Well, when money is the form that is dominant within capital, and when capital takes the money form, then it can easily be shifted from one part of the world to another. I can put investment money or into, say, Japanese bonds and German bonds and French and Italian bonds. I can move my money around very quickly. Commodities, less so. Some commodities can be moved very quickly. Some are much stickier and stuck in place. So in a sense, we see a real difference in terms of mobility capacity depending upon what kind of state capital is in. And of course, in terms of production, a lot of production is heavily fixed in place. I mean, if you have a huge factory and everything, there's a lot of sunk capital which makes it difficult to move. So you can't pick up and move, say, 5 times in a year, whereas I can move my investment funds by minutes if I want in money form. So one of the reasons for actually distinguishing between the moments is to say, each moment has a certain character, and we have to analyze that character and what the possibilities are in that, because then capital will use that character so that if it wishes to create something called globalization, for example, which you've heard much talk about over the past 30 or 40 years, if it's going to work in globalization, almost certainly it's going to mean that money is going to have to be the primary form that capital takes, because you cannot move car plants and steel mills and all that large fixed capital investment around very easily. So that has to be secondary, if you like, to the form of capital if you are going to create a world in which globalization is significant. So take those 3 things: totality, and define a commodity, and define the labor process, and say how all of those things work together through the circulation of labor, through the circulation of capital, and through the different moments that people go through. Now, again, in the Grundrisse, one of the things I did was to look at one of the forms of circulation that Marx does isolate for consideration, and that is the circulation of labor capacity. And in the circulation of labor capacity, Marx proposes that we think of labor in different moments of its experience. And those moments are constitute, as it were, the totality as far as the capacity to labor is concerned. So we start the day then with the laborer waking up in a domestic circumstances, in a neighborhood, in a house, and that, and doing things, having breakfast, sending the kids to school, doing whatever. And so there's a whole life which is to be described, and a moment of social reproduction which occurs in the neighborhood, in the household, and at home. But then the laborer has another field of experience, which is the labor market. The laborer moves out of the neighborhood and looks for a job. And there's therefore a big world of experience of what it's like to go into a labor market. And we see there are different labor markets around the world, different kind of segmentations of demand for labor, different skills, different capacities and powers, and so on. So there's a whole kind of world which is created in terms of labor market functioning. And the experience of the laborer in the labor market is very important for understanding how they understand the world. For example, the labor market is structured that the laborer sells the capacity to labor on an individual basis. Therefore, the market is about individuals seeking to find employment, and they are in competition with other individuals, so that there's not necessarily much class solidarity going on in the labor market. There's a lot of competition between workers. There is often the competition between different ethnic groups for command of certain jobs, and gender discriminations come in. So there's a whole kind of world of experience. And so one of the things, again, that Marx does is to suggest that we'd analyze that experience very closely. And I would then add, we would want the emancipated laborer to ask the question, How should a labour market be organised in a socialist society? Would we need a labour market? If there is a labour market, should it be competitive? And if it is competitive, what are the rules of competition and so on? So that there are, if you like, a whole set of questions that arise in and around the organisation of labour markets. Now, what happens at the end of the day is that at a certain point, a person gets hired. And at that point, they move into the labour process. They move, and that is, the labour process is under control of capital. Capital chooses technology, and the productivity of labour is dependent upon capital's choice of technology. And so the technology then becomes significant in terms of what is happening in the labour process. But the labour process is under the command of capital. And so in a sense, what the labourer does is they don't sell themselves to the capitalists. What they do is they sell their capacity to labour, and that belongs to capital. And so capital then decides how to use that capacity to labour, and labour is supposed to do whatever it is the capitalist tells him or her to do. So this is then, if you like, the crucial point where there is a class relation. And at that point, we often find that the class itself starts to organise themselves collectively against the power of capital. So we start to see the question of a class relation as opposed to the competitivity that reigned in the labour market. We see in the labour process a class relation emerging in which alienated capital and alienated labour work together to create something. And what do they create? They create surplus value in the form of commodities and all the rest of it. So this is the second moment, if you like. But then at the end of the week or the day or whatever, the labourer gets a wage. And this leads to the third moment, in which the labourer now is free of whatever it is the capitalist is telling them to do in the world of production, and is free to take the money and do with it whatever they want. In other words, they are free individuals, but they're expected to use the money in certain kinds of ways. For example, they need to save some money for potentiality of unemployment. They need to save money for old age. They need to have, in many instances, a bank account, which will involve them in bank services and all the rest of it. And they're likely to have a credit card, and there's credit card services. So there's a whole world of choice which goes on, which is not entirely the choice of the labourer. Because if capital decides to pay the labourer electronically, then the only thing the labourer can do is to set up a bank account, get the money electronically. And if they get it electronically, then of course it can be taken away electronically. There'll be fees, banking fees, credit card fees, all kinds of scams can occur in the credit market. So there's a whole world of how to handle money, which is very much underestimated as being significant for the way in which capitalist system works. But this experience of what is going on in the money market and what's going on in the monetary moment is therefore something that needs to be taken very seriously. And I would here notice that when you look at the wage, a lot of the wage can be actually clawed back by the capitalist class, except that the industrialists may pay the wage and the financiers will extract the wage, because this is the way that it often works in this society. So that's the third moment. The fourth moment is when the labourer takes the money and takes it into the supermarket and buys all the things that are required in order to reproduce themselves. And this can be, shoes and shirts or items of that kind, as well as food and energy and of course housing and housing equipment and all the rest of it. So what you have then is a situation where the labourer is no longer experiencing the world as a relationship to industrial capital in terms of employment, but he's experiencing the world because it is the capitalists who are selling them the goods. And the capitalists are, of course, setting the price. There's going to be price gouging, there's going to be monopoly power and all those kinds of things. So then this fourth moment which is this moment of the labourer going to market with money in their pocket and spending it however they like, and they should spend it on necessities, and in some instances they can spend it on luxuries. They may be able to save a little and set up as an independent entrepreneur or something of this kind if they can do so. So this is if you like the fourth moment, and then the fifth moment is when all of that is taken back into the neighbourhood, which is the moment where of social reproduction of labour power, which is also partly individual, but partly also social, because the reproduction of labour power requires education, needs healthcare, needs housing, all of these kinds of things. So there's a lot of kind of a social provision which is involved in the moment of social reproduction of labour power. Now, the point of here is to say that the circulatory process is one in which there are these very different experiences. And if you say, oh, the classic Marxist system of thinking is all about class struggle, and it's all about class struggle at the point of production. But you will see from this that there are different other points of struggle which are just as important in a labourer's life, and that therefore we would want the labourer to, if you ask the labourer, what do you want in terms of your life? They might say, oh, listen, I don't care about the nature of the job. What I do care about is the qualities of social reproduction and neighbourhood life and all those kinds of things, and social provision, good education, good health care, good environmental qualities and things of this sort. So that the labourer, actually, if they start to think of this world as a totality, would come up with very different notions of how to reconstruct the circulation of their capacity to labour in such a way as to make for a meaningful life, for a pleasant life, for a comfortable life, for an acceptable life. So this is what I mean by the pedagogy of the emancipated labourer, because an emancipated labourer would ask the question, well, I just don't simply want a higher wage, because I know that a higher wage can be taken back by monopoly pricing of pharmaceutical products and housing and land rents and housing rents and all those kinds of things. I want an adequate amount of money relative to the pricing of all of those goods. And the emancipated labourer knows perfectly well that if they get higher wages, then a lot of it will be stolen back by the financiers and the credit card companies, or stolen back by the monopoly price gouging which goes on in the sphere of consumption, and will be shortchanged in terms of the provision of social requirements which exist in terms of social reproduction. We think of the qualities of neighbourhood life. So one of the things that people will want to ask is, are we just simply going to be talking about the labour process, or are we going to be talking about the labour market? Are we going to be talking about the actual labour process? Are we going to be talking about what happens in the monetary moment, or what happens in the commodity moment, the buying of commodities moment, or what happens in the neighbourhood? So this is what I mean by emancipated labourer, by a labourer who understands that the real point of politics is not to deal with any one of those moments in themselves, but to start to think about the totality of the experiences that they have in terms of the circulation of their labour capacity, and then use that knowledge to start to actually create a political movement which is going to say, well, we need to improve the qualities of all of these elements. And actually, at a particular historical moment, in a particular place and time, it may be that the main moment is going to be the activities of credit card companies and financial manipulations and the actual stealing of identities and things of this kind. So there may be something of that kind which will come up. So then the pedagogy that we would look for is exactly along the lines which I've just outlined, which is to say, we're going to look at the totality, and we isolate a totality. In this case, it's the circulation of labour capacity, and that labour totality is such as to lead us to then say, one of the biggest things we've got to do is to stop monopoly pricing, to stop rising land rents and all the rest of it. And for example, somebody was making the point the other day that a lot of consumer goods have declined in price because, you know, we have Chinese commodities which are very, very, very easy to get and very, very cheap. And so in some instances, things have become much cheaper. But one area where they've become much, much harder to get is housing. So that housing and affordable housing suddenly becomes a major issue. And you would say a socialist movement is not simply only going to be concerned about the conditions of labour, which of course we should be concerned about, but mainly is concerned about the access to affordable housing. And I think that it is very significant that affordable housing has become a worldwide problem right now in ways that was not the case in Marx's time. So this is too talks about then the transformation and why we talk about politics in motion, because over time, different elements will become, different moments will become prominent, and different features of the system will become apparent to you. So this is why I think that the pedagogy of the emancipated labourer is the way to start to think about the system that we're looking at, which is the capitalist mode of production, and the capitalist mode of production as a totality made up of these different circulatory processes, circulation of fixed capital, the circulation of interest-bearing capital, the circulation of state revenues, circulation of labour capacity, so all these different circulations of money and circulations of commodities and so on. All of these different circulatory processes are present within, and each one of them actually helps to define a set of problematics that we might wish to address in the attempt to construct an alternative society to the one which we currently possess. So that is, if you like, why it is that we call this new platform. We're going to investigate this process of what Marx calls becoming, the constant becoming of capital. And by that he meant the constant evolution, transformation of everything which is going on, and that process has to be looked at. So though we set up a static kind of structure of the circulation of labour capacity, we start to see that it is being transformed all of the time by the growth of the system, by the general conditions prevailing in labour markets and in financial possibilities and in wage goods determination and things of this kind. So this is, if you like, why we will want to talk about both the circulation of these various forms that capital takes and the forms that labour takes, these circulatory processes, the different moments within those circulatory processes, and then ask the question, how can this all be changed? How can it be restructured in ways which are going to lead to everybody to have an adequate life, in an adequate living environment with a reasonable standard of living for everyone? This is the ambition. And so the heart, if you like, the heart of what it is we want to do in this podcast platform is precisely to try to elaborate upon things in this kind of way. So look forward to continuing this sort of discussion over the coming months, and other people will be joining in, and we hope that we will create a major platform for rethinking our whole approach to what anti-capitalist politics might be about.